is on multiplying and dividing integers. The reason I put multiplying and dividing together is because they have the same rules to follow when we're using those integers. And remember, integers is just a fancy word for positives and negatives. It includes those negative whole numbers. So here are the rules you have to follow anytime you see any multiplication or division. Remember, we're not adding and subtracting. Those rules are going to be completely different. But anytime you see that multiplying or dividing, here are the two rules you need to remember. One negative always wins, which means your answer is going to be negative. But if you have two negatives, they actually cancel out and it'll make your answer positive. So say that again one time with me. One negative always wins, two negatives cancel. So now let's actually get into some examples. On number 1, how do we know this is multiplication, first of all? Because how do I know that's not just 3 minus 2? Well, remember, I keep going back to this. Anytime you see touching just means multiply. And right here, the 3 is touching the parentheses, which means I just have to multiply. Well, 3 times 2, I know is 6. That's the easy part. But now I need to figure out, is my total answer going to be a positive or is it going to be a negative? Well, all I have to do, remember, is count how many negatives I have. In this whole problem, I have 1 negative. And going back to the rule, 1 negative always wins. So all that means is that 6 has to be negative. That's it for multiplying integers. So now let's move on to another example. The 4 is touching those parentheses, which means what? Multiply. So I have to multiply the 4 and the 5. Well, 4 times 5 is 20. Now I have to make sure and go back and remember, well, is that 20 going to be a positive or is it going to be a negative? What's cool about multiplying and dividing is all you have to do is count the negatives. I have a negative on that 4, that's 1, but I also have a negative on that 5, which means I have 2 negatives. And my rule is 2 negatives cancel. So these 2 negatives right here are going to cancel out and just become positive. Now, do you have to have that little plus sign in front of the number when it's a positive? Nope. Just the number means positive. When you have a negative, you better make sure you put that negative though. This one gets a little more complicated because right here I have 1, 2, 3 negatives. Well, wait a second, I don't have a rule for that. We'll get there. When you're multiplying more than 2 numbers, we can only do 2 at a time. So basically, I'm just going to multiply the first 2 together first, and then I'll include that last one. With multiplication, the order really doesn't matter though, so we could have multiplied these 2 first. It doesn't matter, I'm just choosing to multiply the first 2. So 2 times 3, when I'm combining these, I get 6. And right here, I still have a negative 6. Now, why did this 6 become positive? Well, remember, 2 negatives cancel each other out, and it makes this 6 positive. But now I still have that touching this last parentheses of the negative 6. So I need to multiply 6 times 6, which becomes 36. But I still have that 1 negative right there, which makes my final answer negative 36. So when I have 2 negatives, these 2 negatives are going to cancel out and become positive. But over here I have 1 extra. So we can change our rule right here, and instead of just saying 1 negative, we could say 1 extra negative will always win. So 2 negatives will always cancel out, but when you have that 1 extra, it's always going to win. Well, these 3 on the top are on multiplication. So now let's do some division. What's cool about this is the rules are exactly the same. So right here, I have a fraction bar. Well, remember, fraction bars, I know they freak people out, but fraction bars just mean divide. So now, instead of multiplying 16 and 2, I'm just going to divide 16 divided by 2. Well, 16 divided by 2 is 8. But now let's go back to our rules and double check. Is that going to be a positive 8 or is it going to be a negative 8? Well, let's just count the negatives. I have 1, 2 negatives. And remember, 2 negatives cancel out, so this 8 stays positive. So let's move on. On this problem, well, wait a second. Now we have some multiplying and dividing. So remember, that fraction bar also means grouping. So we have to multiply the 2 numbers on the top first, because they're on the top and the numerator together, and then we're going to deal with that 9. What I like to do when there's a lot of orders of operation, I just like to figure out, is my answer going to be positive or negative first? Then I don't even have to deal with it. So all of this is multiplying and dividing, and how many negatives do I have in this whole problem? Well, I only have 1, and 1 negative always wins. So I'm going to put a negative down here in my answer box before I even do any work, because I know my final answer is going to be negative. Now all I have to worry about is the multiplying and dividing. Well, 6 times 3 is 18, and 18 divided by 9 is 2. But remember that 1 negative always wins, so it's going to be negative 2. Because technically, negative 6 times negative 3 is negative 18, and the 1 negative wins. Now as we move on, the last example. This one, over here we did multiplication before division, because it was all one big fraction together. Over here, my fraction is separate from that number, which means I have to do that fraction first because that fraction is a grouping. So let's divide. Negative 15 divided by 3. Well, 15 divided by 3 is 5. But remember, 1 negative wins, which makes it negative 5. But don't forget this guy over here. You're still multiplying negative 4. So when I'm multiplying 5 times 4, I just get 20. But how do I know if it's positive or negative? Well, I have 2 negatives that are multiplying. And remember, 2 negatives cancel out, which just makes this right here a positive 20.